let us move to our first session. I will pass the relay to Robert Koopman, Chief Economist and Director of the Economic Research and Statistics Division of the WTO Secretariat. Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. It's a great pleasure to moderate this session. So over the last 16 to 18 months, we've seen global trade initially contract significantly and then substantially expand. We really need to better understand the vaccine manufacturing and trade supply chain. And in this session, our efforts are focused on this better understanding, particularly of the dynamics of the supply chains themselves. This is work that we also need to do with an eye towards the future. So the focus of this session on mapping vaccine manufacturing and trade, we will address the following three main questions. What are the latest projections on COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing output? What can supply chain mapping exercises tell us about vaccine manufacturing production and related value chains? Vaccine producers are experiencing bottlenecks in their supply chains. Which types of problems are being experienced and what can policymakers do to address them? We're very, very fortunate to have a stellar panel who can share their expert views on the challenges around mapping vaccine manufacturing and trade supply chains. So without much further delay, let me dive right into the panel. You can see their biographical data on the event webpage, so I won't be introducing the speakers with any kind of detailed background. But let's turn to our first panelist, and that's Rasmus Bach Hansen, CEO and founder of Airfinity. Rasmus, can I ask you to get us underway by giving an overview of the latest projections for COVID-19 vaccination production and an idea of where this production is taking place? Rasmus, the floor is yours, please.
Hello, Robert, and thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm just starting my video here.
We can see you, yes, and hear you. Great.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me, and also thank you.
And let me remind you, 6 minutes. Okay.
Yeah. So we prepared some high-level views on the first question you addressed. What are the projections for the vaccine production globally? And I wanted to take my 6 minutes to share that, so I would go straight to it. Hope you can see my screen here.
We can see your screen, yes, and it's now full.
Just very briefly, so Airfinity, we are an independent provider of science information and production data. We monitor global vaccine production throughout the world. We work with a number of countries, large pharmaceutical NGOs. We also work with WTO. And to track and forecast where we are on the production side, what we know about the real world evidence on effectiveness, side effects, etc. We see as part of our duty to inform the public with accurate information, so with partnerships with a number of large media companies, including Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, CNN, and others. When we look at the production, I think it's quite, as you alluded to, it's quite a remarkable picture we are seeing. We are, while it was slow to begin with, we are seeing an quite incredible ramp up of production globally. We're especially kind of seeing a lead of 4 vaccine producers. It is an extraordinary development, especially from the Chinese vaccine producers, Sinovac and Sinopharm, that's grown more than I think many of us anticipated. Pfizer, as you can see of this Pfizer-BioNTech's vaccine, has had a very steady, stable growth and is now the second largest produced vaccine. And then AstraZeneca, while off to somewhat of a slow start, we can see that Oxford AstraZeneca's vaccine is really growing fast with a very steep production curve here. Other vaccines are Moderna, that we're seeing a somewhat slower growth, but stable. And then there are some that may be surprising a little bit in their lack of output, which where I would put Sputnik, the Russian vaccine. J&J's has also not produced at the scale we expected, and a few others. Globally, so far, according to our most recent numbers updated today, the world has produced 3.3 billion vaccines. So I think we should just take that in and say that is a really remarkable number when we compare to the total vaccine production last year, around 5 billion, according to, depending on how you measure it. But by all means, we are halfway through the year and have already had that many vaccines. And if you can see on this on this graph, it is also accelerating. We've had 1 billion vaccine produced over the last month alone, and 314 over the last week alone. So we're really seeing an acceleration of global production throughout. If we look at how is that going to play out for the rest of the year, which is of course a really critical question, then we project our forecast is changed daily according to the numbers and according to what we know of the individual factories, how they're ramping up. So very detailed forecast analytics system we've set up here, and it's kind of been moving between 10.5 billion to 11, and now over 11.5, 11.8 billion for the year, very much dominated by some of the large vaccines that I mentioned before, AstraZeneca, Sinovac, Sinopharm, Pfizer, but also we are seeing newcomers into the space, although they will have somewhat less of an impact. To the left, you can see all the vaccines that are included in this forecast. But I think, some people say this is way too optimistic. That might be the case, but looking at the current trajectories, it is actually not doesn't look that optimistic. And if you compare that to the manufacturer's own projections and what they've said, this is much lower than that. If you combined all of those public statements from vaccine producers, you would get to more than 20 billion. So we are quite confident that around this number will be achieved this year, unless something dramatic happens. I should say that, of course, doesn't take into account potential booster shots, third shots, and the whole demand supply is something we look a lot into. And I don't have the time to go into that in detail, but just to say that some will probably be saved for booster shots and also for second generation of vaccines, which means that some factories can be taken out of the equation, and that will also impact that. So this is somewhat of a high level linear forecast. When we look at where is all this production taking place, then we have identified 83 different production places throughout the world. It is clearly dominated in Europe, US, and some parts of Asia, and there are some remarkable gaps, as it's been pointed out in the public debate. Africa, hardly any. South America, hardly any. I would also say when we look at CDMOs versus own production of substances, that significantly many more CDMOs. So it does seem there seems to be quite a lot of technology transfer already happening in the space, but combined with the in-house. But I think a really important point I want to make here, and bear in mind that we are an independent provider, so no stake in the debate over technology transfer or not. But I just want to point out that there are clear economies of scale in vaccine production. So when we look at where is all this production coming from, it is the majority is coming from own production at own sites. So the whole kind of distributed network of vaccines has not yielded yet the results we're seeing. So the remarkable numbers are primarily driven by production at own sites. Started out with like 90%, 89% from own sites, and we project that to go throughout the year. We'll see more of the CDMOs coming on, scaling up, but not as fast. So we project that 67% of the total production will be from companies' own sites, and I think that is a really important point. Then,
thank you, Rasmus. Could you wrap up in about 1 minute, please?
Yes, absolutely. This slide is exactly meant to be 1 minute. So thank you. No, I just want to make one point on the subcomponents, right? So one thing is the vaccines, but what about all the materials that goes into it? That's where we could see some of the bottlenecks and where that's coming from. So we mapped some of the key parts, the bioreactors, lipid suppliers, glass vials, and syringes, and mapped out where is the core production of those. I think that's an important on a view to global debate on export and imports, and we can really see that the US is a very, very central supplier of these. So I would say from our data, free flowing exports out of the US will be an important component of continued scaling up of vaccines. That was it for me.
Rasmus, thank you. That was a tour de force overview of current production. Excellent. You really did set the stage well for us. Let me now turn to Matthew Downham, Sustainable Manufacturing Lead for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations. Matthew, what can you add to the picture already painted by Rasmus? CEPI is also part of the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force. What issues are emerging from this, the task force process that you would like to share with us? Matthew, the floor is yours.
Robert, thanks very much indeed, and I hope everyone can see.
We can see and hear you. Yes, thank you.
Hear me well. Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking from behalf of CEPI. On behalf of CEPI, let's see if I can put it onto display mode, if that is preferable.
It's okay. It works as is if you want. It's up to you.
Okay. I mean, you can just see a few of my notes. So CEPI, just by way of introduction, is an innovative global partnership. It centers around three core pillar activities, namely to prepare, transform, and connect, with a core vision to establish a world where epidemics are no longer a threat to humanity. When we were founded in 2017 in Davos under CEPI 1.0 strategy, it was primarily to accelerate development of vaccines against emerging infectious diseases. And these are primarily focused in the table on the right-hand side, so Lassa, MERS, Nipah, etc. However, of course, in the last year and a half, a lot more focus has been driven towards COVID, particularly in collaboration with the COVAX partners, namely CEPI, the WHO, Gavi, UNICEF. So all four of those organizations have formed COVAX. However, quite recently, in the last couple of months, together with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and then the three trade associations, IFPMA, DCVMN, and BIO, have formed the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force that has the core objectives to try and prioritize and ensure COVID vaccine supply under the COVAX mission, particularly with prioritization with emphasis on the AMC 92 countries, and to try and mitigate unintended impact on other vaccines and health products. And long-term plan is to initiate regional health security through establishment of sustainable regional long-term manufacturing of vaccines. Rasmus, just before us, touched on the core activities around sort of the supplies. So the supplies like vials, single-use facilities like filters, bioreactor bags, tubing, etc. And this is something that the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force has been focusing on quite specifically as a result of a global summit that was held on the 8th and 9th of March. I won't go through all four of the work streams that the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force has established, but the first and primary one focusing on today's discussion is focusing on two core activities. One is to launch a marketplace for critical input supplies, namely all those components I've just mentioned, to facilitate aggregated data gathering, to facilitate also transparency to support forecasting in future, which all comes into the kind of discussion. It's also to look at free flow of goods, free flow of those critical supplies. We've had quite some discussion in both of these areas and made quite some progress. Let's see if I can move there. Okay. So what we've done particularly is we've had interviews with a whole range of COVAX manufacturers, people who supply COVAX with COVID vaccine, but also those critical input suppliers, the manufacturers of the filters, the tubing, the bags, the chromatography media, and also many of the CEPI CMC leads and experts. Those interviews are still ongoing, so this is an initial snapshot of some of the feedback that we've got with respect to the free flow of goods, or more particularly, where they have not been free flowing quite so readily and have caused an impact to COVID vaccine manufacture. And you can see just from the items in bold where some of the kind of core issues lie. In other words, the regulations in terms of how things are treated, particularly drug product export for non-commercial technical reasons. There's aspects relating to VAT in terms of vials donated, particularly, let's say, to COVAX. The United States has got the Defense Production Act legislation. This has had certain impact. And as Rasmus articulated a moment ago, a predominant number of the supplies come from the United States. You can see through the rest of the slide the kind of core issues highlighted in bold. And what's been identified is the need to address, firstly, three kind of core things: the global trade facilitation, i.e. customs, the technical barriers to trade, i.e. regulatory aspects, and the trade export restrictions, all of which are long-term goals. In the shorter term, there's the need to support that rapid creation of bilateral agreements to ease import and export of supplies. Now then, supplies themselves are restricted by limited interchangeability. And this slide summarizes some of those kind of discussion points that we've had. In terms of, a single-use bioreactor bag cannot simply be changed for another single-use bioreactor bag. They're licensed component parts for a specific manufacturing process. So the interchangeability from a regulatory, from a licensure perspective is very difficult to facilitate. Given the constraints of vaccine supply over the last year, there's been quite a pressure on the suppliers. So there's about a half a year to a year lead time for certain kind of core components into what is already a complex global supply chain. There's limited interchangeability, there's matchmaking required between manufacturers. There's also that need for demand forecasting, which of course the marketplace is endeavoring and hopefully going to be achieving. There's a need to standardize supplies and provide that flexibility for changeovers, particularly to those maybe supplies that are impacted by the Defence Protection Act. There are additional country-specific challenges related also to the export and import of supplies. So all of this relates to supplies related to the interviews that we have held. But in addition to that, and I'll just touch on this briefly, there is the need to have vaccine workers moved readily around the planet to support vaccine manufacturing. And you can see where there are significant entry requirements and quarantine requirements, all of which call for countries to grant travel exemption for critical vaccine workers and prioritize their vaccination to be able to travel. And that ends my presentation and interjection. I hope that adds to the discussion, Robert, and to what Rasmus has carefully set out the scene for prior to me. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for another excellent overview. Clearly, a number of challenges here, and highlighting the importance of trade facilitation, the regulatory environment, and export restrictions. Thank you very much, and we hope to come back to you with some questions for follow-up as the program continues. Our next speaker is going to be Giulia Del Brenna, head of the Unit for Strategy and Regulation, Single Market and Industrial Policy, DG GROW, European Commission. Giulia, can I ask you to give us a policymaker perspective? The European Commission has tried to map and matchmake between vaccine manufacturers in the EU single market. What have you learned from this process that you would like to share with us? Giulia, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see me. Thank you
We
for
can see you
welcoming
here.
in this seminar. Thank you to the other speakers. So in the European Union, late 2020, we began authorizing COVID-19 vaccines. And obviously everybody was, like in the whole world, very excited of this scientific feat. But we knew that the science, that was difficult, that was exceptional, but the industrial challenge was something even more difficult to achieve to vaccinating obviously the whole world. But for us, the immediate objective was to vaccinate by the summer 2021, 70% of the adult population. And even with Europe being having such a tradition and being such a leader in vaccine production, that was not easy to achieve. Also because the process of getting vaccines in the arms of European citizens was totally new in a way. Usually it takes 10 years to develop a vaccine, and companies begin scaling up after the authorization of the vaccine. So they have a limited production capacity, and then they scale up, because that's a bit the model of risk they can take. In this case, we intervened with advanced purchase agreements to give an incentive to companies to take the risk of scaling up manufacturing capacity before authorization of vaccines, but this was clearly not enough. And in February 2021, the President charged Commissioner Thierry Breton with leading this task force for the upscaling of industrial production. And we organized our work in 4 strands: mapping, prioritizing so that one could really use all resources to these industrial challenges, synchronizing, because you can have all the vaccines you want, but if you're not able to do such a massive vaccination campaign, and for this campaign you need people, you need skills, but you also need certain materials and inputs, and that was shown in a very nice slide from the previous speaker. And then matchmaking, because Europe has a big tradition of producing vaccines. There are a lot of resources, some used for vaccines that are life-saving in other ways, some not used because this is a business model that if you want to have security of supply, because problems can arise with yields, with security, and we saw that, we all read that in the media, what can happen in a factory if there are errors. So you need to have, let's say, you need to have flexibility in the supply chain. And this is totally new solution because companies do not really have flexibility now. That's why we went on first mapping all that was there, and a lot was there, but is doing something else, is doing polio, is doing child vaccines, is doing everything. Also, not all that is there is adapted to mRNA vaccines, and that was a totally new thing now. So mapping was essential. I will not go on what was prioritization and synchronization for lack of time. But we then saw the necessity of mapping also what existed for critical inputs. And critical inputs and bottlenecks were not exactly where we thought. We talked a lot at the beginning of the crisis of lipids, and the market is very tense. It's a new market for mRNA, but we saw a number of problems with disposables that was described before, and with fill and finish, even though we have a lot, in theory, a lot of capacity in the European Union. That's why we did also matchmaking, and we had an event end of March, which was a big success. More than 300 companies from the whole supply chain went to be present, a lot of bilateral exchanges. And this was a success, because if the market had been functioning well, we would not have had a success. We would not have had so many participants. And that shows how this situation is exceptional and needs public intervention to support the scaling up of manufacturing, and things are going far better, I would say even very well, in the European Union, but there is clearly a need to translate that towards the rest of the world. As our president says, nobody's safe until everybody is safe. What did we learn? We learned that first, don't take things for granted. It's not because we are such a vaccine leader that things will go well. So don't take things for granted. Also look at the whole of the supply chain. Plastic caps could be a problem, potentially, plastic caps of vials. So we have to look at everything. We have also to give a very important role to partnership with the whole supply chain. Public policy is important as a support and not as a barrier to doing more. And I will finish with that because my time is up. Thank you very much.
Giulia, thank you. That was excellent, highlighting the importance of a government coordination role, and particularly identifying that often there are gaps to inform decision-making, whether in the private sector or in government. I must say we've had an amazing response in production and international organization coordination. And now we've got very good insights on lessons learned from the Commission's experience. So now let's turn to our next speaker, Andrew Wilson, Global Policy Director for the International Chamber of Commerce. Andrew, the ICC has been active in seeking to address supply chain bottlenecks during the pandemic. Can you give us an overview of these actions and your views on how supply chain transparency could be improved moving forward? Yeah, Andrew, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Delighted to. Thank you, Robert, and thank you very much for the invitation today. First of all, let me just start by saying a few words on the International Chamber of Commerce and our role in this particular area. We don't, of course, have any as a cross-sectoral organization representing something in the region of 45 million businesses, have any particular vested interest in the medical industry or the pharmaceutical industry in particular. Rather, we see this as a critical economic challenge. And I think if anyone questioned the analysis that we published in January about the potential risks of vaccine nationalism and a prolonged pandemic in the developing world, you only now need to see the supply chain risks and supply chain disruptions causing essentially a drag on growth in Western economies in the very sectors that we predicted. So we think this is an absolutely critical path economic challenge as well as a moral and a public health one. I think what we've seen through the crisis is that inefficiencies in medical supply chains have, in many instances, despite the tremendous efforts of the private sector and some of the major investments that have been made, hindered the global response to COVID-19. And very clearly, to end the pandemic, we need an effective, internationally coordinated response. On that basis, we think there is significant merit, and congratulations, Robert, to you and the WTO for pursuing this, in looking at what can be done to enhance the effectiveness, efficiency, and resilience of supply chains. We think there are vast benefits for policymakers in terms of planning purposes. We think there should be, if a regime can be designed effectively, significant benefits for suppliers, producers, manufacturers in the supply chain. And we also think that there'd be great benefit to companies within the broader economy. And one thing we're seeing in particular at the moment is growing frustration from companies in emerging markets who are unclear when, if at all, vaccines will arrive. That's why in April, as you'll be aware, John Denton, ICC's Secretary General, proposed the idea at the last WTO Symposium of establishing some kind of clearinghouse facility. And we've been delighted to see many of those elements adapted or integrated into the vaccine manufacturing task force. But we think there's more that can be done, particularly in terms of taking a midterm view on this challenge. How do we actually prepare these essential supply chains in the future to ensure that they're genuinely robust and fit for purpose? And we see a system potentially emerging that we think has some precedence and potential promise, where private sector participants could anonymously report production bottlenecks or challenges, including trade facilitation challenges. And just on that note, I think what the WCO said earlier is certainly correct. We haven't seen facilitation challenges on supplies of finished vaccines, but we are seeing facilitation challenges on ancillary products. So that remains a challenge. So we think this needs to be a holistic mechanism that can actually bring in private sector insights across the full production network. We think within that it obviously needs to be an important public element to establish a clearinghouse that can collate and aggregate data and then publish that in a non-commercially sensitive way. And we think that this is not just something that needs to be developed for the COVID-19 crisis, but actually something that would serve a longer term purpose in terms of building a more resilient global economy. We do think this is technically feasible, having consulted with a number of different companies and providers in our network. There are already very effective supply chain monitoring solutions in use in a number of sectors, automotives and agriculture, to name just two, often at the national level. But clearly this needs to be something that is global, given the nature of vaccine production chains. We also think there's potential use in engaging third-party data providers and artificial intelligence tools. We also think the Agriculture Market Information System, AMIS, is a potentially useful analog that could be replicated in this area. We recognize vaccines are slightly more complex, but we think it's a reference point that can be effectively used, replicated, and scaled in certain respects. One thing I really want to emphasize is this does have to be global. It's great to see many different national and regional initiatives, but we think to be effective and really to service the needs of emerging markets in particular, there needs to be some form of global solution. And we're certainly looking to the WTO and other international partners for leadership in this regard. One final point before my time's up is to say, one thing we think is absolutely vital is that this is done in a way that incentivizes engagement from the private sector, that encourages the private sector to provide essential data. Clearly, that has to be done in a way that respects commercial sensitivities within the market, avoiding disclosures that would cause commercial disruptions. But we don't think that is an insurmountable obstacle. And we think it should be possible to create something that is voluntary, with clear upsides for participation, and with limited disclosures required that don't get into commercially sensitive areas. Just to conclude, we would very much encourage the WTO, the WHO, and other partners to accelerate work in this area, not just looking at the short-term task or the short-term challenge of vaccinating the world, but to think of the longer-term challenge of actually establishing medical supply chains that allow us to combat future pandemics with greater efficacy and efficiency, and ultimately speed. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Yeah, market information is critical for good decision-making. We heard that the EU had to ramp up its capabilities to assess its domestic circumstances. And there are examples out there where this kind of information can be collected and shared to help inform good policymaking. And I absolutely agree, cooperation between the private sector, national governments, and international organizations, I think, is absolutely critical to helping ensure that we can provide good information to health security efforts going forward. Thank you very much, Matthew. Our next speaker is going to be Hongyu Wang, Vice President, International Business of CanSino Biologics Incorporated. Hongyi, this month, China administered its 1 billionth dose. Congratulations. Could I ask you to talk through the supply chain underpinning this success, discuss the trade dimension to vaccine production, and where issues may be arising in this respect for your firm? Please, Hongyi, the floor is yours. And reminder, 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Koopman. Thank you very much for your invitation. I'm very happy to be present on the WTO platform to share some useful information and experience related to Chinese vaccine manufacture. In fact, until today, the latest number of vaccinated dosage was over 1.3 billion already in China instead of 1 billion, with an average of about 18 million dosage per day over the last 20 days. At present, 6 manufacturing companies have already got the conditional approval of EUA or EUA in China. China's total COVID-19 vaccine production capacity is expected to exceed 7 billion doses by the end of this year. China has provided more than 350 million dosage of vaccine to the international community, including vaccine aid project to more than 80 countries and exporting vaccines to more than 40 countries. China will provide the first batch of 10 million doses of vaccine to the COVID-19 implementation plan, specifically for the urgent needs of developing countries. Among these 6 companies, most of them supply inactivated vaccines. Our company, CanSino, is a unique company in China who supplied the 1-dose vaccine based on adenovirus vector. In March 2020, CanSino has launched clinical trials phase 1 and for the novel coronavirus vaccine, firstly in the world. And in April, a randomized double-blind clinical trials phase 2 was conducted in the city of Wuhan. It was the only novel coronavirus vaccine in the world to enter clinical trials phase 2 at that time. In September 20, clinical trials phase 3 was launched in 5 countries, including Pakistan, Mexico, Russia, Chile, and Argentina. We have been cooperating with 78 research centers according to the interim analysis of our clinical trials. The efficacy of the vaccines against COVID-19 attained 68% after 14 days of vaccination and 95% against the severe disease, indicating a significant preventive effect. The brand name of this vaccine, we call it in Chinese COVAX. COVAX has more advantage in vaccination procedure, transportation, and storage. The single-dose injection reduces the numbers of vaccination compared with multi-dose and improves the efficiency so as to improve compliance to the vaccinated population. In terms of transportation and storage, COVAX can be stably stored for 2 to 3 months under normal temperature conditions, which greatly saves the transportation and storage cost and enables the company's vaccines to be transported to some area with efficient cold chain condition, and the guaranteed quality. So convention has better accessibility. CanSino was successfully listed in Hong Kong and Shanghai in the recent 2 years. That allowed our company financially to establish 2 new production plants in Tianjin and in Shanghai, with an annual capacity of about 500 million to 600 million dosage per year. In addition, the company is ongoing transfer technology project in Pakistan and Mexico, where the bulk will be refilled in local facilities. The international cooperation program has greatly improved vaccine production level in these countries and helped them train a number of qualified production and laboratory staff. Till now, we have got registration for several countries. We are receiving requirements from different countries every day. The demand for Covisha in the international market is very huge. Since the outbreak of the COVID-19, global demand for vaccine raw materials has grown rapidly, especially in China. In terms of supply chain, we also met a big challenge. Based on this, we have taken some positive and effective measures to ensure the production. Firstly, we analyzed the supply chain from both micro and macro perspective, and strengthened the communication and coordination between internal production, external supply, and the demand. Secondly, we made a comprehensive inventory of all the raw materials to ensure that different raw material arrived at the warehouse on time. At the same time, more attention is paid to the ratios of raw material to ensure the best quality of supply. Thirdly, for some key raw material, we increased the order quantity and extended order period. The original delivery period of the raw material has changed from about 3 months to 6 months currently, or even more. The global epidemic situation is still grim, and the global supply is still in serious shortage, and the imbalance problem of vaccination is still serious. And thank you very much for WTO's attention to the global supply chain of vaccines. We actively urge that every participant in the supply chain, including CanSino, should take actions to strengthen international cooperation with the most positive attitude to ensure that vaccine become a public good, fair, and affordable. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hongyi, for that excellent overview of your efforts to ramp up vaccine production in China. I think it would be very interesting for us to hear a bit more about the steps you took to analyze and coordinate along your supply chain. I think there's a lot of interest globally in how the different ways that this can be done. And given China's large manufacturing scale and capacity and its integration into global supply chains, I think your experience would be very, very interesting to learn from. So now let me turn to our next speaker, Letitia Bigger, Vaccine Policy Director for the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association. Letitia, the IFPMA put out a position paper at the end of May outlining 5 steps to urgently advance COVID-19 vaccine equity. Could you walk us through those issues from a supply chain and trade perspective? Please, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Robert. And I thank WTO for inviting the IFPMA to this important event. Let me just look back a year and a half ago, and I have to say that we can see a deep sense of responsibility that has been the driving force behind the effort of the innovative industry. Breaking all historical records in vaccines R&D, manufacturing capacity expansion, and production, today we can really count on several safe and highly effective COVID-19 vaccines. But from the beginning, we knew that scaling up manufacturing capacities would be a daunting task. So companies scale up vaccine manufacturing at risk, supported by countries' risk-sharing models, even though it was not sure yet which, if any, vaccines in development would be approved by health authorities. Since the outset of the pandemic, companies have been looking for the right partners that fit the need for scaling up such a complex manufacturing process that you have with vaccines. And we saw biotech, large pharmaceutical companies, and contract manufacturing organizations working together, with today over 300 agreements in both developed and developing countries. As mentioned by Rasmus before, we are getting the job done. By the end of this month, over 3 billion vaccines doses will have been made from zero a few months ago. And we are on track to produce an estimate to 10 to 12 billion by year end. Just to put that into perspective for the participants, the global production estimate of vaccines for 2019 before COVID-19 total 5.5 billion doses. But by signing to the Act Accelerator in April last year, we committed to work together with others to ensure fair and equitable access to vaccines and to leave no one behind. Concretely, this has meant socially responsible pricing, tripling the world capacity in a year's time, and committing doses to COVAX, as well as other agreements with developing economies. Since February, COVAX has successfully shipped over 89 million COVID-19 vaccines to 133 economies. 1.5 billion doses delivered through COVAX to the ANC 92 economies remain within reach with current supply agreements and donated doses by year end. But as it has been said at the beginning of this symposium, despite this massive effort to scale up and produce billions of doses, we still see those vaccines not reaching equally all priority populations worldwide now. The pace of COVAX deliveries has been affected by countries that have supported R&D and manufacturing scale-up at risk, but reserve supply in excess of domestic requirements. And most recently, the tragic Indian epidemiological situation and related export restriction has also affected the COVAX delivery. As said before, following the Chatham House summit in March, we have increasingly been calling for immediate action to improve dose sharing, as well as to tackle bottlenecks in the supply chain and restriction. And this is why we launched the 5 steps plan, where we call on manufacturers, governments, and non-governmental organizations to work together to take urgent steps to further address this inequity. We believe that action is needed now and must focus on 5 key steps. The first one is stepping up responsible dose sharing. The latest development from G7 countries, which pledged 1 billion doses for low and middle income countries this year and next, with hopefully more to come now, is extremely encouraging. COVAX announced last week an estimated of 550 million doses to start becoming available in significant numbers very soon. The second action is to continue to optimize current production, including through additional voluntary collaboration with trusted partners that can produce significant quantities without compromising on quality or safety. Third action is to support country readiness. We need to ensure that countries are ready and able to deploy those doses, and we are already seeing some countries giving back doses or worse, those expiring. Fourth, the fourth action is about driving further innovation. The evolution of the virus is a stark reminder that innovation is key to be and to continue. Our scientists are working to improve the vaccines for new variants, but also to improve the formulation and the storage conditions. And fifth, and this is our today conversation, is to eliminate all trade barriers to export and further streamline regulatory procedure. To conclude, what we need today is to have those globally integrated supply chain for COVID-19 to work at their full potential to produce over 10 to 12 billion doses by year end, enough to vaccinate the world's adult population. This goes hand in hand with expanding and streamlining regulatory review and reliance practices, adopting alternatives to on-site inspection, reducing import and release testing requirements, and expediting raw material supplier qualification for new suppliers. And we need also to facilitate the cross-border supply of key raw material, essential manufacturing material, vaccines, and prioritizing the movement of skilled vaccines manufacturers. As Matthew mentioned, the task force that has been set up a few months ago, we are on board here to work with them, and we hope for the WTO and its members to play a key role here. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Letitia. Very much appreciate your summary of the 5 steps that IFPMA laid out. And clearly, there's going to be a continued need for innovation But perhaps the biggest challenge we see as manufacturers have increased output rather dramatically is ensuring more equitable distribution of that output. So I think that's something that we'd like to hear more about and how to do that. Now, let me turn to Elsie Soto, Vice President of Supply Chain Emerging Markets for Pfizer. Elsie, can I ask you to discuss Pfizer's recent announcements at the G7 summit and discuss the challenges that you may have to overcome in supply chain management to continue the successful scale-up of manufacture and rollout of vaccines internationally? As you saw from Rasmus's projections, Pfizer's been one of the rapid growers. So please, let's hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks so much, Robert. And, as a Pfizer manufacturing colleague, it's a pleasure to join you guys. Thanks so much to WTO for putting us together to have this important conversation. So maybe addressing some of your questions. At the beginning of the global pandemic in March last year, you remember we announced our Pfizer's 5-point plan, where we committed to sharing our scientific tools and insights, our development expertise, and our manufacturing capacity. 1 year later, we are very proud of the progress we have made altogether. We have concluded agreements to supply 122 countries, and we are currently in advanced negotiations with more. At the recent Rome Global Health Summit, we pledged to provide 2 billion doses of our COVID-19 vaccine to low and middle income countries over the next 18 months. 1 billion doses in the remainder of this year and 1 billion next year. As part of this effort at the G7 with President Biden this month, we also announced our commitment of 500 million doses to the United States at a not-for-profit price for the COVAX AMC 92 and the African Union. Our manufacturing scale-up has been extremely successful, and we're very proud of it. We just announced that we will reach 3 billion doses this year, doubling our initial projections, which has been frankly amazing. For Pfizer, our rapid scale-up was made possible by focusing on 2 networks, one in Europe and one in the US. With facilities that already had a proven track record of sterile injectable manufacturing and sufficient scale to rapidly accelerate manufacturing. We tripled formulation capacity, we added additional fill finish lines, and we also doubled our batch sizes, minimizing lead time between batches and increasing our yields in production. In addition to that, we also validated new suppliers within these networks that we implemented. By employing new learnings and efficiencies, we have continued to reduce our lead times. We are now approaching an average of 60 days from start to vial ready, which is almost a 50% reduction to our original lead times. Our strategy, we feel very proud of it, and we feel really has paid off in this situation. At the same time, Pfizer continues to evaluate new manufacturing partners with appropriate expertise and trained personnel. We welcome the priority that countries are placing on building strong manufacturing of sterile injectables for future pandemics. This has to be accompanied, though, by a policy environment that enables viable and competitive manufacturing. And this also should include robust regulatory framework and predictable policy environment for innovation, and a focus on skills and infrastructure. As the OECD noted earlier this year, vaccine manufacturing is currently geographically concentrated, given its high degree of specialization. This concentration also means that a large majority, of both developing and developed economies do not have significant vaccine manufacturing capacity. Intellectual property has also been brought into the wider debate on manufacturing access and equity. So I did want to underline our views. Scarcity of goods, not IP, has been the main barrier to COVID vaccine manufacturing. IP rules help incentivize innovation and enabled our partnership with BioNTech. We invested $2 billion at risk in our COVID-19 vaccine program. Other companies have also taken financial risks and used the IP system to support unprecedented partnerships. We would not be where we are today without the predictable system of IP rules established by TRIPS. Manufacturing scale-up is also critical to driving equitable global access to vaccines, but it needs effective trade policy to underpin it. I want to emphasize why advancing the Trade and Health Initiative at the WTO is so important and why ambition levels should be so high. WTO rules have helped support our manufacturing scale-up, which has depended on global supply chains and the swift transit of goods. We have 280 different materials sourced from 19 different countries that go into our COVID-19 vaccine. If any one of the 280 components from suppliers, however trivial, is delayed, we cannot manufacture or release the vaccine. We experience firsthand how export restrictions impact supply chains and patient needs. As an example, in the spring, each finished batch of our vaccine made in Pours, Belgium, needed 41 quality tests. 13 of the tests require samples to be exported to specialized R&D facilities in the US. Without this, we couldn't release manufactured batches. We saw export restrictions for vaccines cause delays to exports of these vital and time-sensitive testing shipments, as well as those for clinical trials. Where export restrictions are applied, they should be targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary. Prior notification to the parties is also vital. Trade facilitation is also a critical area. The pandemic highlighted the impact that inefficient border procedures can have on patients. Early on, imports of critical medicines were blocked because embassies were closed and documents couldn't be legalized. A range of measures can help in this area. For example, electronic preclearance, eliminating consultation, and public-private partnerships to tackle counterfeiting. Finally, reducing and eliminating tariffs on critical goods and inputs is also important. Applied tariffs remain high in many countries for both medicines and a wider range of medical products. The same is true for inputs. Even a small tariff on this will cumulatively increase the cost of production, which serves neither those wanting to scale up nor the needs of patients. Without open trade, access efforts to countries and patients in need will fall short, no matter how many vaccine manufacturing plants are built around the world. That is why it's so important that WTO members consider how to discourage export restrictions, facilitate trade, lock in best practices, and ultimately ensure that vaccines and other critical medical goods are delivered safely, swiftly, and efficiently to people around the world. At Pfizer, we're fully committed to our purpose, breakthroughs that change patients' lives. And we are very proud of the impact that the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine has begun to have around the world. Pfizer remains steadfast on our commitment to WTO, and we welcome the opportunity to support your efforts to address these challenges. So thanks so much for your time.
Elsie, thank you very much for those specific examples of the kind of challenges that Pfizer has faced. Gathering that kind of information is very, very critical for us to be able to map the choke points in the supply chain. And also, thanks for giving us a heads up about the policy environment down the line. I think that's going to be very important for governments and firms and international organizations to be thinking about once we've solved this particular problem. We want to make sure that we're well positioned to address future problems. So thank you for that heads up. Thank you. I'd now like to turn to our next speaker, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, CEO and Managing Director of Hester Biosciences. Rajiv, welcome. So Hester is an experienced player in the vaccine business, albeit a different branch, vaccines for animals. Can you talk about Hester's experience of expansion into human vaccine production and your international expansion? Rajiv, thank you.
Yeah. Good morning to everybody. It's indeed an honor for me to be here today to be one of the speakers. Hester Biosciences is currently predominantly an animal vaccine manufacturer producing vaccines against poultry, cattle, sheep, goat, and swine. Recently, we have gotten into working on the COVID-19 vaccine. We have tied up with an Indian manufacturer, that is Bharat Biotech, for whom we would be manufacturing the drug substance, which is the inactivated bulk antigen, and it would be supplied to them for them to ultimately finish and sell it as their final vaccine in the India and in the international market. We also have a setup in Africa, which we started off predominantly as an animal vaccine manufacturing unit. But looking into the current situation worldwide, as an animal vaccine manufacturer, we strongly believe that vaccine units, plants should be such built, modularly designed, in a way that there is a lot of flexibility between manufacturing animal vaccines as well as human vaccines. Not they all need to be put in the same building, but you need to have different blocks within the campus so that one has the freedom. Also, talking about the type of vaccines to be made, there are a few zoonotic diseases which are always endangering everybody, and there is always a thread. I think that not only us, which we are venturing into creating BSL-3 facility in India as well as in Tanzania, but overall vaccine manufacturers and the world, we all need to be aware that we need to also look into the conventional way of manufacturing vaccines, that is handling the virus, handling the bacteria in a contained facility, because sometimes it becomes necessary to handle the virus and also produce probably a live or an inactivated antigen as compared to the recombinant or the other genetically modified vaccines. So these are a few things which we have learned from the time we started producing the COVID vaccine and onto what we want to take things further. In terms of the current worldwide situation in enabling companies to manufacture vaccines, there is an acute shortage of various equipments on certain specific bioreactors, on certain specific cell propagating equipments, etc. So we all have realized that, yes, the need has come all of a sudden, but there is a big scope and a need that all need to be prepared and be agile, because these things could happen. Today has happened with COVID. Tomorrow it could lead on to another endemic, pandemic situation, which might allow us to need all these equipments. And also in terms of worldwide movement of vaccines, raw material, in case if things are made a little simpler in terms of the registration processes. Talking about Africa in specific, each country currently has a different registration regime. Now there are groups that have been formed and they are looking at joint registration. But these things, if addressed at this point of time, it will go a very long way to ensure that each country also receive the vaccines which have been produced in other geographies and supplied onto these countries. That's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Rajiv, thank you. Thank you for that. Could you dive a little bit, since you're very efficient with your time, into the BSL laboratory issues? That might be very helpful for the regulatory session we have later today.
The BSL, the whole issue for us to get delayed into this current production, to be very honest, is that we did not have the BSL-3 facility. Handling the basic virus, it's not possible without a very strict biocontainment area. In this case, it is BSL-3. And some of the delays in the world, I am sure, have been caused because of the BSL-3 facilities not being available. And that's something very crucial to handling any such microorganism which might seem to be lethal for mankind or even for animals. So it is very important to have few setups of biocontainment facilities, BSL-3, BSL-4, in various parts of the world to handle any such emergency situation and help the world tide over, or at least get a solution towards addressing towards that virus or the bacteria.
Thank you very much, Rajiv, for these interesting insights and particularly the ideas of thinking about modular design and flexibility in future production. Thank you. And now let's move to our next speaker and our final speaker in this session, Karel Dumarche-Servaz, Executive Director for Health for Animals. Rajiv mentioned the future pandemic threat posed by zoonosis. What do you think COVID-19 tells us about the potential for One Health approaches and the ability of the veterinarian vaccination sector to absorb spare COVID-19 vaccination manufacturing capacity in the future? You see this kind of flexibility, and would address one of the questions or concerns that Elsie had about the regulatory environment and competition going forward.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Koopman. And as the last speaker, I'll try and be pointed and leave some time over at the end for discussion. But I'm going to address that point. But just to be clear, Health for Animals represents the global animal health sector. So we represent all of the global manufacturers, almost all of them, animal health products. So that includes vaccines, about 85% of global producers. And to jump right in on the regulatory point, the rapid regulatory approvals of human COVID vaccines really show that it is possible to move more rapidly through approval systems without compromising, efficacy, safety, and quality, which are the three things they look at. But I think that regulatory agencies now need to shift a gear on a permanent basis, because a whole new battery of vaccine technologies is being developed, both on the human and the animal health side, which bring great possibilities. And Pfizer vaccine is an example of that. Regulators need to catch up with that rapid evolution of innovation. Maybe to the question regarding vaccine production capacity, just to give some context, the animal health supply system is different from the human vaccine supply system. Our market is smaller, our prices are lower, the number of species is obviously larger. It's a more fragmented market, and there are many more veterinary vaccines on the market than human vaccines. But production standards are by law the same as in human health. So that means that you can produce to the same standards, and are required to by law indeed, as in human health vaccine standards. And Mr. Gandhi from Hester, I think he made that point very clear, that some production facilities are theoretically and could be changed over, and that's an interesting discussion. I'll come to that in a second. But animal vaccine production facilities are producing vaccines, intended to prevent animal disease outbreaks right now. And there's been a rapid growth in demand for animal vaccines in the last few years. And that growth is driven partly, or mostly, I would say, by a recognition that prevention is better than treatment. And there's been a rapid change there. But and again, to the question, should additional vaccine production facilities be created by public entities? Technically and theoretically, yes, these could be used to produce animal vaccines. But when looking into this, and I think this is an important point, you should also it's important to look at commercial interests as well. Which companies would be interested in operating those? And the point was made earlier of moving people around. A large issue is, of course, qualified personnel. And that's an important issue. During this crisis and very early on in the crisis, animal health vaccine producers did have discussions with governments in a number of countries to see whether it was appropriate to use animal health facilities to produce human COVID vaccines. And these discussions happened at very senior levels early on in the crisis, and in at least 6 countries, and those happen to be the 6 largest vaccine producing countries in the world. And ultimately, it was decided in all of those countries and where these conversations happened, that it was deemed more appropriate to continue to produce animal health vaccines and to use them for that. But very, very serious consideration was given to changing over some of the large facilities. But it was deemed more important to continue to produce the needed animal vaccines. And looking at the One Health perspective now, and let's be clear, the majority of zoonoses find their origin in wildlife. So that's the examples like Ebola or MERS or plague. This one we're looking at right now. And cutting animal vaccine production is going to create unintended negative human health consequences. It's another problem we really don't want to have right now. Vaccination of animals protects humans as well. And this is obviously the case for livestock, but where animal source foods represent a significant proportion of the protein and the calories produced and that humans consume. There are obstacles related to movement of animal vaccines into countries, into some countries where conditions in some countries are making it challenging to move them there. The reality is that some countries are not getting certain animal vaccines because it's just too challenging to get them in. And this is certainly an area the WTO could lead in, and we would welcome that. But what's really needed, and this is kind of goes to the end of my remarks, is a global vision on disease prevention in humans, but also in animals. We need a global vision for disease prevention. Now, if you look, richer countries have invested significantly over many years in animal disease prevention and subsequently have radically reduced the spread of disease and the impact, the negative impact on animals, but also on humans. And it would be really of great value if WTO and other organizations would focus their political energy on disease prevention. So to conclude, as we move on and look into November, there's going to be a global pandemic preparedness and prevention discussion about an agreement. It's critical to include animal disease. 60% of diseases are zoonotic, mostly from wildlife. Any approach that does not take into account the 60% is problematic. With that, Mr. Chair, I'm 30 seconds over. Excuse me. Thank you to the WTO, and thank you to you, Mr. Chair, and the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol. By my timing, you've got 7 seconds left, but well,
in that case, no, just kidding.
So thanks for reminding us about the knock-on effects, not just between animal and human, but probably the focus on COVID-19 and the implications for other vaccine manufacturing. Those need to be maintained also. Now, I'm supposed to have 7 minutes to close, but we are running a bit behind. So I think our speakers have really done a great job and laid out just an amazing landscape for us to consider. So we heard from Rasmus on the manufacturing production increases that we see happening, that we heard from Matthew on the challenges that CEPI is trying to solve in increasing the expansion of vaccine manufacturing and spreading that to developing countries. We heard from Giulia about the EU's efforts to have the government play more of a coordinating and facilitating role and the importance of that. We heard from Andrew on the importance of private sector government and international organization cooperation, and particularly trying to find ways for transparency about market information so better informed decision-making can occur. We heard from Hong Yi about China's dramatic scale up of production and the different approaches and connectivity with other countries. Letitia gave us an overview of the IFPMA's 5-step efforts around COVID-19 manufacturing, and we can see from the Airfinity estimates that that's worked well. We heard from Elsie that Pfizer's really made significant efforts itself to expand production and has concerns about production and the market conditions down the road. She did bring up tariffs on inputs and supplies, and you'll see in a presentation in the next session that we've gathered some of that information, among other information for you. We heard from Rajiv around animal vaccine production and how that may help and think about a modular design with human production. And then Carol reminds us the importance of having a global vision for disease prevention. I think I'll stop there and I'll turn over to my colleague, Suja Rishikesh-Mavrodis, Director of the Market Access Division, will take us into session 3, mapping cross-border movement of vaccine inputs. Many thanks to all the speakers in this session. You did a great job. We're going to have a summary of this available for the audience and for our own internal purposes and yours after the event. Thank you. And Suja, the floor is yours.